web TV della Camera dei Deputati. Ricordo altresì che la partecipazione da remoto è consentita a colleghe e colleghi secondo le modalità stabilite dalla Giunta per il Regolamento. L'ordine del giorno reca, nell'ambito dell'indagine conoscitiva sulle tematiche relative alla proiezione dell'Italia e dei Paesi europei nell'Indo-Pacifico, l'audizione di rappresentanti del Committee for Freedom in Hong Kong. Anche a nome dei componenti del Comitato saluto e ringrazio per la disponibilità a prendere parte ai nostri lavori il dottor Mark Clifford, Presidente del Committee for Freedom in Hong Kong, e il dottor Mark Saba, Direttore per l'Unione Europea ed il Regno Unito. Ricordo che il Committee è un'organizzazione che nasce per promuovere la tutela delle libertà fondamentali ad Hong Kong, nonostante gli obblighi legali, trattati e le ripetute promesse secondo cui Hong Kong avrebbe continuato a godere delle libertà esistenti. Dal passaggio di consegne del Regno Unito nel 1997, la Cina ha conculcato la libertà dei media, la libertà di parola, di riunione, più in generale la matrice democratica che aveva sempre contraddistinto l'ex colonia inglese. In particolare nel giugno 2020 la Cina ha introdotto a Hong Kong una dura legge sulla sicurezza nazionale, che ha esteso in maniera indebita i concetti di sovversione, separatismo, terrorismo, collusione straniera. Come conseguenza, decine di oppositori politici sono stati perseguitati e incarcerati. Si tratta di un precedente assai pericoloso, che aumenta le preoccupazioni sul futuro di Taiwan, da cui dipendono molti dei futuri equilibri geopolitici globali. Forniti questi elementi di contesto, do subito la parola al Presidente Clifford affinché possa svolgere il proprio intervento.
Thank you very much, Honorable Paolo Fortini, MP, and members of the committee. I very much appreciate the opportunity to speak in front of you about the current situation in Hong Kong and to tie it in with the global geopolitical environment. As you've just heard, China promised in a 1984 international treaty that when it took over Hong Kong, that the then British colonies' existing rights and freedoms would remain uninterrupted for 50 years. In fact, China promised much more than that. Under the mini-constitution, the basic law, it promised to the people of Hong Kong that they would be masters of their own house, that they would enjoy more freedom under Chinese rule than they had during the 156 years of British colonial rule. They would enjoy the right of free assembly, free worship, free speech, the right to jury trials, all the things that those of us in democratic countries, in open societies, take for granted. In fact, China went further. It promised that for the first time, Hong Kong would enjoy democracy, something that it didn't have under Britain. It had freedom, civic freedom, but it did not have political freedom and political democracy. It promised Hong Kong that its people would be masters of their own house. There would be Hong Kong people ruling Hong Kong. Now let me, before I go further into my remarks, I'll just give you a little bit of background on myself so that you'll know who you're listening to. I moved to Hong Kong in 1992. So I moved there 5 years before the British handover. I was a journalist. I worked for international magazines, but I also had the great privilege and honor of being the editor-in-chief of both of the English language newspapers, South China Morning Post and The Standard, where I was the publisher. So I know many of the people who are involved on both sides of this. And I think although many of us were skeptical that China run by the Chinese Communist Party would continue to allow freedom to flourish in Hong Kong, for the first 10 or so years, there was reason for cautious optimism. China continued to allow the commemoration of the June 4th Tiananmen Square massacre in Hong Kong. That's the only place on Chinese soil where that commemoration was allowed to continue. So every year on June 4th, tens, often hundreds of thousands of people would gather in Hong Kong's Victoria Park for an evening of solemn tribute and remembrance for the Tiananmen Square massacre, for the dead in Tiananmen. In fact, I was there at the final one in 2019, and I think there were about 160,000 people. It was extraordinary, peaceful. Everyone from children a few months old to people approaching 100 years old. It was a great outpouring of civic pride and civic participation in Hong Kong. There were other rallies. In 2003, 500,000 people took to the streets in a successful attempt to prevent China from imposing a national security law on Hong Kong. And I think Hong Kong people rightly feared that a national security law would be used to curtail and to end the freedoms that had been promised by China. And in fact, 2 ministers almost immediately resigned in the wake of this protest, and a year later, or a little more than a year later, the chief executive, the mayor, effectively also resigned. So we could see that the Hong Kong people were developing a voice. In 2012, when the government tried to impose communist-style propaganda education into the school system, students took to the streets and the government withdrew the proposals. So we could see that there was some tolerance for dissent. But how long could dissent go on in Hong Kong? I think at what point were the pressures of more openness, the aspirations for democracy, going to really run up against the wall of the Chinese Communist Party? And in 2014, we saw the Chinese Communist Party start to lose its patience, I guess, with the people of Hong Kong. For all the promises that the territory would move towards democracy, and I should say that in the basic law, the mini constitution, as I alluded to, there were promises of more democracy. There were promises that the people of Hong Kong would move towards universal suffrage. All they were asking was to be able to elect their mayor and their city council. But in 2014, Beijing decided that even that promise was too much for them, and they moved to exert more control on the city. That resulted in hundreds of thousands of people again taking to the streets, and a 79-day occupation of the city, which ended with a number of arrests. Over the next few years, the tensions became stronger and stronger, and it became clear that the Chinese Communist Party wanted to bring Hong Kong under its firm control. In 2019, a bill was introduced which would have broken down the firewall between Hong Kong and China, between the common law legal system in Hong Kong, a system where defendants were guaranteed the right to trial by jury, they were guaranteed the right to bail, they were guaranteed the right to be presumed innocent until guilty, all the things that open societies have. The Hong Kong government tried to change that and to allow people who were suspected of a crime to be sent to mainland China. Mainland China, of course, where defendants never have a trial by jury, don't have bail, and are almost always found guilty. In response, millions of Hong Kong people, sometimes 2 million people in a single day, took to the streets in protest. And you think of a city of 7.5 million people, 2 million people taking to the streets in protest is a big number. This went on for months until Beijing finally lost patience and imposed a national security law 4 years ago on June 30th, 2020. Since then, Hong Kong has gone from one of the freest, most open cities in the world, a place that on its surface wasn't too different from Rome, a vibrant media scene, art scene, all sorts of civic associations, NGOs, activists, to something approached in the authoritarian, totalitarian, dystopian nightmare that is today's China. So 5 years ago, there were 0 political prisoners in Hong Kong. Now, there are over 1,800 political prisoners in Hong Kong. At the Committee for Freedom in Hong Kong Foundation, we're focused above all on trying to get political prisoners out of jail to ensure that while they're there, they're not forgotten, that the eyes of the world are not averted from Hong Kong, that although Hong Kong may seem like a long way away from Rome, in fact, the crackdown in Hong Kong, the rapid dismantling of an open society, in fact, I would argue the ending of freedom in Hong Kong has been more rapid and more thorough than anything that the modern world has ever seen, short of war. Obviously, we can't compare this to Ukraine or Gaza or Burma. But the jailing of so many people who were leaders, people who were deputies, who were essentially your peers, people who were, well, I was on the board of directors of Apple Daily, the main pro-democracy newspaper there. 7 of my colleagues are in jail, including the very brave, singular, remarkable Jimmy Lai, a man who came to Hong Kong as a 12-year-old penniless entrepreneur, built a fortune, became a billionaire in the clothing business, and eventually decided he wanted to go into media. He thought that transparency, openness, reform were the direction that China was traveling, and he built a successful newspaper and magazine empire, first in Hong Kong and then in Taiwan. He wouldn't shut up. He wouldn't bow to the Chinese Communist Party. He wrote what he thought, and for that, he was led away in handcuffs. He was put in jail at the end of 2020. By my calculation earlier today, he spent 1,339 days in jail since then, most of it in solitary confinement. He's now being tried on national security law charges that are really amount to nothing more than to meeting colleagues like you. He met a number of congressional members in the U.S., above all in the U.S. Vice President, the U.S. Secretary of State, and he warned about the dangers to freedom in Hong Kong. And for that, he's being sent to jail. Now, I mentioned Jimmy's case because he's the most high profile. He's a man I've known for 30 years. I was on his board of directors. It's obviously a case that I feel very strongly about, but we could go on and on. A number of Hong Kongers have been nominated for a Nobel Peace Prize. We have young people, journalists, lawyers, unionists, professors, people like you, city council member, actually city council because it's a smaller place, people that would be regarded as among the finest, most upstanding, most involved citizens that any society would want to have. And those people have been in jail, sometimes on trial, sometimes just being held in jail without bail. They're being tried, despite all of China's promises, they're being tried without juries, before special hand-picked judges. They're not being allowed bail, and they're being accused of crimes which violate a number of international treaties as well as international agreements in terms of civil rights and human rights. Now, I go into this detail about Hong Kong because I think that what the Chinese did in plain sight in Hong Kong, in contravention of its international promises and treaties, particularly given the counterparty, another sovereign state, Great Britain, augurs very, very poorly for what China intends to do for Taiwan, and indeed for the rest of the region, and I would say for the rest of the world. Now, it might sound a little bit far-fetched to wonder or to worry about China. Here we are halfway around the world, but in fact, China is exercising influence through elections, through media, through social media, in every way that it can to try to narrow the terms of debate. So whether it's talking about Uyghurs, talking about Tibetans, talking about the right of Taiwan to continue to rule itself, to decide its own destiny, or we're talking about domestic politics in Canada, in Australia, in the UK, even in the US. Every time we've looked, we find evidence of Chinese nefarious actions, involvement in domestic politics, involvement in trying to narrow the range of debate. And I've seen firsthand how China has broken its promises in Hong Kong. I know what they're planning with Taiwan. All of you know, too. It's no secret. Xi Jinping has made no secret of the fact that he sees his mission as one of taking back Taiwan. And I think that the lesson with authoritarians, with dictators, is that the easy thing in the short term is to try to mollify them, to go along, to just hope that one more concession will solve the problem. But I think we can see with China, just as we've seen with Putin in Russia, that policy just doesn't work. And the sooner that we wake up and start speaking out and speaking up, the easier it's going to be to push back the authoritarian tide that I think threatens us from many countries and throughout the world. I am particularly interested to be here in Rome because the bishops' agreement, which the Holy See first made in 2018 with China, will be up for renewal this year. I think that we all have to look at the issue of religious freedom in Hong Kong as we consider, and I think as the Holy See considers whether or not to renew that agreement. I'm sorry to say, well, I'm happy to report that Jimmy Lai and a number of other people are finding the Catholic faith a source of tremendous strength in prison. And as a matter of fact, I understand that Jimmy Lai feels freer than he's ever felt before, thanks to his Catholic faith. He's able to read some of the theology that he hadn't had a chance to read when he was out running a newspaper. He has a chance to perfect or further improve his artistic abilities, drawing religious imagery. He has a chance to pray a lot, despite having to do forced labor. And so his faith is a source of great strength. But I also know from talking to him, from talking to Cardinal Zen and other Catholics in Hong Kong, that there's tremendous concern that the Holy See is so anxious to establish diplomatic and other relations with China that it's in danger of leaving behind believers in Hong Kong in particular. And so religious freedom is one of the many freedoms that China promised the people of Hong Kong, and yet it's being chiseled away at the moment. Jimmy Lai is not in jail because he's Catholic, but his Catholicism sustains him in jail. And we don't know how much longer he's going to freely be able to practice his faith. We don't know how much longer the many Catholic schools in Hong Kong are going to be able to teach freely. We've already seen signs that the Chinese Communist Party and the People's Republic of China are putting their imagery and their teachings into the very important religious schools in Hong Kong. The Catholic population in Hong Kong is large. The school population consists of several 100,000 students. This is not a small number. Catholics are disproportionately represented in the pro-democracy movement, and I think it would be a real travesty and a shame if they were somehow forgotten because there was an attempt to have diplomatic relations with Beijing on the part of the Holy See. So that is not directly related to your committee, but I do think it speaks to the broader geopolitical environment that we work in. So let me stop now. I'd be happy to answer any questions. But again, I want to thank you for the opportunity and the privilege to testify today.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, members of Parliament, of the Chamber. My name is Mark Saba. I cover the issues that Mark Clifford has raised for the UK and Europe. And what I want to just express to you all is that there is a pattern of behavior that China or the CCP is showing across the continent. And I think that this pattern is moving right across most Western countries. The most susceptible countries are smaller, economically weak and politically weak countries where the grip is even tighter. And the important thing to remember is that Xi Jinping is a dictator in the vein of any other dictator that we see in the world today. And we don't treat other dictators in the world softly. We take a stronger position. We take a strong position politically, economically, and certainly in the way we speak to them. For some reason, when it comes to Xi Jinping, we are afraid, we are concerned, and we are worried about dealing with him as any other dictator. And that's a problem for many countries. Xi Jinping has changed the constitution that he can be elected president for life. If this was happening in any other country, we would show deep concern and worry, and yet for some reason, barely a flicker, a few news articles, and we carry on as normal. The other thing that is important to know is that Xi Jinping and the CCP have taken prisoners from countries all over the world, from Ireland, from Sweden, from Australia, Jimmy Lai from Britain. Dozens of countries have citizens who are detained, and they are then used as bargaining chips for trade deals, or to get a better deal, or to end a deal, or to end a threat. I suppose one of my questions to you deputies is, on the day that an Italian citizen, a businessman, a journalist, a student is detained, what is your plan? What will you do to release him? What mechanisms have you got to put pressure on the CCP? It's something worth thinking about before it happens. Talk to your counterparts in the Republic of Ireland or Sweden, or even us in the UK with Jimmy Lai. What plan do you have for the day, because it will happen, that an Italian businessman or student or journalist is arrested and accused of being a spy and sentenced without a trial to 25 years? What's your plan? The other thing that I want to say to all of you is this, and it's very important in a business context. Listen to the voices of people who are warning you about the way things are going with China and with the CCP. Don't only take into account those who are promising wealth, success, and riches. Listen to the people who have had to escape. Listen to the people who try to help those who escape. There are organizations just like ours, IPAC, Hong Kong Watch, and many others who dedicate their lives to bringing the voices of people who are imprisoned, detained, and most importantly, the people suffering transnational repression. Under Xi Jinping, he chases opponents all over the world. He chases them into our borders as European countries. He disregards the laws and the norms of how you deal with people who are granted citizenship or protection in our countries. And I think it's very important that we, as Western democracies, push back against this behavior, that we defend people who settle in our country, and that we don't stop raising the voices of those people who are detained, because the best thing that can happen for the CCP is that those names are forgotten. So whether it's Jimmy Lai, a businessman, whether it's Gwyneth Ho, Li Chak-yen, or any of the other prisoners in Hong Kong or in mainland China, it's very important that you say their names out loud when you have your speeches, say their names out loud when you have business negotiations. Never stop to think about the issues on supply chain risks to Italy. When you negotiate deals with the Chinese, it's never in good faith. Please take into account that the Chinese government has broken contracts with multiple countries and businesses. Countries as big as Google, Zoom, LinkedIn, they have all suffered through interference from the Chinese state. Many of them are forced to comply with Chinese law about giving over data, names, and so on in order to continue practicing there. And it's very important that you here in this chamber and your colleagues are aware of those risks when you encourage trade deals. There's nothing wrong with doing business with China, but there is a big problem with doing whatever China wants to have that business. And that's the biggest difference. So please keep in mind those risks. And I ask you all to keep in mind those people who are being held illegally, and to listen to the voices of people who are giving you warnings before something happens to Italian citizens. Thank you.
Grazie.
Many thanks for these statements. I'd now like to ask our colleagues if they would like to take the floor. Giulio Centimero. Yes, thank you, Chairman. The first question is whether you also have any evidence of cases of torture on detainees in Hong Kong. Also, the first speaker mentioned a significant presence of Catholics in the pro-democracy movements. Have there been any cases of anti-Catholic activity or destruction and damage of churches? Are there any other questions? Mr. Rossini and Ms. Gardini. My question is perhaps trite. When the West, United Kingdom, decided to hand over Hong Kong to China, as often occurs in diplomacy, quite a lot of hypocrisy, because it was quite easy to foresee that we would see the developments which we are seeing today. What can be done at this point in Hong Kong? Which tools realistically are available to Western countries? I'm not saying to solve the problem, because I don't think it can be solved, but at least to mitigate the scope of the persecutions and the restrictions of freedom to the people of Hong Kong. Thank you. Ms. Gardini. Thank you. First of all, I'd like to thank our guests very warmly, because we're talking about a part of the world which for many years we felt as a piece of the West, which was far away physically, but I remember I was there when it was still under British rule, and I remember a country with a civilization which is very similar to the ones we live in. Everything has changed now. I would like to ask a question with regard to a report which was published by your foundation a year ago, where you launched an appeal to the international community, and specifically referring to the United States. I don't know whether this appeal has been repeated, to keep our level of attention high and not to lower our voices. I would like to ask you whether there's been any reaction to this appeal. What's been the response of the international community, particularly the United States, in view of their weight in the international community? And I also would like to repeat the question my colleague Orsini asked. What can we do better and more, because we're faced by this Chinese giant, which is has a very weighty presence on the stage of international relations, and politically is so different from us in its way of behaving, but it's also a multiform entity, because it can play lots of different roles. It can be the worst of polluters and the best of environmentalists. It's this has this ability to change its appearance and its shape, and that makes things more difficult for us, for you who are face to face with these problems. We'd like to have something, some concrete inspiration. Thank you, Mr. Dini. Thank you. I also wish to thank our guests today for the very interesting comments. And as my colleague said, it's true, freedom and democracy in Hong Kong is at the very least seriously endangered. Censorship of the protest team of the Hong Kong movement, and books which have been withdrawn from libraries. I saw, for example, the so-called book on wolves and sheep, which has been withdrawn because it was considered to be teaching a bad ideology. From what we know, and I'd like you to confirm this, there are no specific lists of books which have been withdrawn from trade for these reasons. So we're in a very gray area. It's not very clear what has happened. But it's also true, as my colleagues said, that Hong Kong is an advanced economy. It's one of the most important financial centers in the world. It has a per capita GDP which is very high. It's often said that in Hong Kong, West meets East, to show that Hong Kong is close to our Western values. So from a certain point of view, the situation in Hong Kong is similar to the situation in Taiwan. From other points of view, it's very different. Taiwan is an island. It is not a special administrative region. And so if there are any specificities, particularly with such a heavy-handed China, which is so intrusive with regard to democracy in Hong Kong, as it wishes to be in Taiwan. There are also some differences. So I'd like to ask you what you consider to be the situation in Taiwan compared to Hong Kong, and whether you have any suggestions or any specific ideas with regard to that situation. Thank you very much. Mr. Porta. Yes, thank you, Mr. Formentini. Thank you, Mr. Clifford. I would like to express my thanks for the very broad and updated perspective you've presented with regard to the situation in Hong Kong. We all hoped that the other saying, one country, two systems, might have taken root, guaranteeing rule of law, fundamental rights to the people of Hong Kong. This is not what's happening. You've confirmed that freedom of the press, religious freedom, and also, I think, union freedom, because I think that the union movements have also been shut down. So my question follows on from what Mr. Billy was saying, and I'd also like to refer to Mr. Clifford's experience as a journalist in how does Taiwan situation, which is the focus of many international observers, how can that situation help or probably complicate the progress of democratic claims in Hong Kong, and what role could players like the United States have, or the European Union, since we're on the eve of a very important round of votes in Europe? Thank you. So I'll give the floor to reply.
Mr. Formentini, you've given me a very
È davvero un compito difficile quello che mi ha dato onorevole Formentini, perché ci vuole tempo per rispondere e cercherò di essere succinto chiedendo a Marco di aiutarmi. La tortura, ci sono prove, alcune prove di tortura, soprattutto nel caso di Jimmy Lai.
China held in difficult and probably dangerous and illegal circumstances there, then ominously transferred to a psychiatric facility in Hong Kong. I think all of you who are familiar with totalitarian governments know the abuses that take place in psychiatric facilities. There's also increasing evidence of forced indoctrination, brainwashing, re-education, under very difficult situations that's taking place in Hong Kong prisons, particularly among the very many young people who are incarcerated. So it's not, the trend is definitely moving in the wrong direction. Excuse me, and is becoming more like the mainland system of so-called injustice. On the more positive side, the question about Catholic churches, there's been no destruction. My colleague Frances Hoy came out with an excellent report on religious freedom. I'd be happy to send it to any of you. And what she's finding is that we're seeing the Chinese Communist Party, the People's Republic of China, and just the state in general moving into churches, forcing Chinese flags to be put up in front of religious imagery, for example, in front of Christ on the cross. We're seeing more so-called national security, so-called patriotic education now taking place in church settings. And by the way, we're also seeing this happening in the Muslim community. Some Muslim leaders were taken out to the Xinjiang region, came back and said, everything is fine out there, everybody's happy. So we're seeing religious leaders for, I think sometimes well-meaning reasons, but religious leaders becoming complicit in an evil system, and we're seeing that happen on a systematic basis. And Frances Hoy detailed this on a very granular level. But we're not seeing the kind of breaking down of churches, destruction of churches we saw in the mainland. However, one of the main architects of that was brought down to, a guy named Sha Baolong, was brought down to Hong Kong to oversee the implementation of national security regime in Hong Kong. So the signs are very troubling, but there's still time to stand up, I think. And this is why it's very important that groups like yours know what's going on and speak out as much as possible. I think there was a question about the UK and the US. I'll kind of answer that at once. We're fortunate enough at the Committee for Freedom in Hong Kong Foundation to have offices, fully staffed offices in both London and Washington. London, because of the historic ties between Hong Kong and the UK. Washington, just because, as speakers have indicated, it's a powerful country. We're finding in Washington in particular a great receptivity. China and Hong Kong as part of that are very, very much part of the conversation in Washington. It may be one of the area of the most profound agreement that China is potentially an existential threat, certainly a long-term strategic threat, short-term tactical threat to the United States, that we need to meet China. Now, we don't always agree on all of the specifics, but I'd say on Hong Kong, we have a lot of interest and we have legislation moving through. So, for example, Hong Kong has 3 quasi-consulates called Hong Kong Economic and Trade Offices in Washington, in the United States, in Washington, San Francisco, and New York. They were set up to underscore one country, 2 systems, to try to promote Hong Kong, especially economic and trade issues. Instead, they're increasingly used as propaganda outlets, and we have a bill that's actually advancing through Congress, and we're quite optimistic it will pass this year, that would essentially force the president to close the economic and trade offices. Now, there is some concern about retaliation from China, but I think the overwhelming consensus in the U.S. Congress is these economic and trade offices need to be shut down. And you might look in Milan, because you have an economic and trade office that's doing business today. It's open right now. I think that throughout Europe, people might look and see what these economic and trade offices are doing. Just last week, 3 people were arrested for spying on behalf of Hong Kong, and the main ringleader was the number 3 guy in the UK, in the London Economic and Trade Office. In Germany, a similar organization, Hong Kong Trade Development Council, an alleged spy who was working there was just arrested. So I think we're seeing that there are these very insidious nodes in all of our midst, and that we can do something about it. I mean, so in the U.S., we are going to shut down the economic and trade offices. We're also finding, because I think the question is, what can we do? We're finding that sanctions work. Now, I know this is not perhaps part of your parliamentary or governmental toolkit, but we have put sanctions on a limited number of Hong Kong officials just after the crackdown began. We now have, we have very, very active discussions with the administration and with Congress about a targeted list to go after not just policemen and sort of obviously bad people, but for one of the first times to go after judges and prosecutors as well. Now that's very controversial, because people don't really like to interfere in the legal systems of other countries, especially places like Hong Kong, that, as you say, when you were there, it looked like it was, a very open Western-style legal system. It's not anymore. And so I think sanctions, economic and trade office bills, there's some other moves to undercut Hong Kong's I should say Hong Kong is destroying its reputation as a trusted financial center. So we have some research coming out. We're seeing increasing amounts of money laundering and also goods laundering coming through Hong Kong. So I think soon you'll see work that shows Hong Kong's complicity in fueling the Russian war machine. There's material, as Russia is increasingly shut out of global trade markets, Hong Kong is really filling its niche, and we're seeing money and goods moving through Hong Kong to North Korea, to Russia, to China, to Burma, to Iran, prohibited or gray market dual-use technologies. So you're going to see more work from us trying to show the world the reality that Hong Kong isn't just some little city halfway around the world. It's actually an increasingly important node in helping authoritarian regimes. There are some other things, but do you want to jump in with some?
Yeah, so let me pick up from where Mark stopped. The question that you mentioned about Hong Kong being a top finance center, yes, for now it remains a finance center, but the question is for how long? Businesses thrive on freedom of information. You need a free press. You need to be able to speak to whomever you like, and you need to be sure that the information and the data that you are receiving is accurate and on time and not tampered with in any way. The problem that Hong Kong has now is that that is diminishing rapidly. Number two, companies that are being set up increasingly require someone from the CCP to sit on boards, which is already the law in mainland China. So if you set up a company, you have to have a representative from the CCP. The question is that you can't choose who's on your own board? If you're forced to have somebody on there, let's say we weren't talking about Hong Kong, but we were talking about a country in Africa or South America or somewhere, and you were forced to have a regime member on the board of your company, would you just accept it? And the answer is probably not. So these are the worrying signs about how long can Hong Kong remain a global financial center. The other thing is there is quite clear evidence that many organizations, banks and law firms are very slowly withdrawing staff and relocating some of their sectors. It's not happening in large numbers because that would obviously destabilize companies and industries and cause prices to crash and so on, but it is happening. If you look at the sheer volume of articles that have been published in the last year about certain banks and law firms moving a small team out, 20 people here, 10 people there, but slowly, slowly it's happening. And that's because, again, for the integrity of those businesses, you cannot be governed in the same way that you could on mainland China. That's not why people choose Hong Kong. On the other point that was spoken about what you can do to support the similarities with Taiwan and Hong Kong, there's a few things that we can do. First of all, EU member states should support Taiwan. Taiwan is a liberal democracy with free and fair elections. We just saw one, peaceful transfer of power. If you want to support the people of Hong Kong and you want to maybe show China that you are not going to be taken for a ride, support Hong Kong. Send delegations there, accept delegations to visit you, and do not allow Italy to feel threatened or intimidated that the CCP will punish you in some other way. And if they do, the question is, a point is being proven. Again, if it were any other dictatorship or any other country saying, if you visit that country, we will punish you, how would you as deputies react? And so the question is, if you want to show support, that's something that you can do. You can shut the Hong Kong ETO in Milan. As my colleague Mark has said, increasingly they are being used as a proxy for the Chinese embassy. In London, as you just heard, one of the senior directors was arrested as a spy. Those of us working on behalf of Hong Kongers and Uyghurs and Tibetans, we've been saying that it's being used as a spy agency for a very, very long time. But here we have actual evidence that the British police have arrested someone and detained him on that. So shut the Hong Kong ETO. If there is no longer one country, two systems, then they don't need their own quasi-diplomatic embassy in Italy. Confucius Institutes, which have been rolled out across the EU in campuses all over European universities, those are a product of Xi Jinping. They didn't always exist. It was his attempt to bring officially Chinese language and culture. But we know that they are used to intimidate students. We know that they are used to shut down guest speakers. The Confucius Institutes sometimes interfere in what curriculums are taught, what lessons are taught. In some campuses, they demand that sections on Chinese history are removed. Or they shut down a Tiananmen memorial, or they will, ask a campus to invite the Dalai Lama and see what happens. There are other things that can be done to support Hong Kongers and support of Taiwan. Lifeboat schemes for Hong Kongers who want to get out is a relatively simple thing that can be done, offering people safe passage. It's very difficult for many Hong Kongers now, especially all the very young people who took part in the democracy protests. Officially now they have a criminal record. And so in the United Kingdom, we're finding this very strange situation where they come out of prison after 18 months because they took part in a democracy march, or they wore a T-shirt saying Free Hong Kong, or they waved a flag saying Free Hong Kong. They went to prison for 18 months. They now can't get a job in Hong Kong because no one will hire them. So when they come to the United Kingdom, what we're finding is they can't seek asylum because officially they are criminals. And under the UK system, you can't give asylum to somebody with a criminal record. So is there that sort of situation here? Can we create a lifeboat scheme here? And finally, on Taiwan, Xi Jinping has publicly said he is going to take Taiwan. Before Xi Jinping, all Chinese leaders said it's something that will happen in the future, it's something that future generations will discuss. Xi Jinping has said, in my lifetime. Now, he's already 70, so it's soon. It's coming soon. And if you want to see a test case for how it's going to happen, look at Hong Kong. First, you stop the media, then you have massive cyber attacks to cripple their economy or their trade. Then you remove them from international organizations. You pressure companies to stop supporting them. You threaten countries by saying, if you meet that delegation, we will stop a trade deal or whatever it is. He will try to push this through at all costs. So if you want to support the people of Taiwan and you want to show that you stand for freedom, democracy, and so on, that's the way you can do it. And my final point, a question that's often asked is, how do we fight back against the CCP encroaching into Europe? You don't have to fight the CCP by attacking the CCP. You can show support to Taiwan. You can make sure that there are clauses in your trade deals that refuse products made in Xinjiang. You can just say, we will not sell those products in our Italian markets, and so on and on. Little things like that that slow and delay the speed with which China wants things done. It wants everything done very fast so that it can then immediately pull the strings. I hope that answers some of the questions. Thank you.
Can I just jump in? There are a few things I think that maybe we didn't answer. There was a question about media and about the wolves in the sheep book. I can confirm that not only is that book not sold in Hong Kong, but that at least one of the authors went to jail, and just for being involved with the book, and perhaps a couple of them did. Three of them. Thank you, Mark. 3 of them went to jail. This was, for those of you who don't know, a children's book with a parable about wolves and sheep that the Chinese Communist Party in its wisdom decided was just not suitable for the people of Hong Kong. It was done as a project by the Speech Therapists Union, so talking about the union perspective. It was a kid's book, and people went to jail for that. My most recent book, Today Hong Kong, Tomorrow the World, What China's Crackdown Reveals About its Plans to End Freedom Everywhere, was withdrawn from public viewing at the University of Hong Kong, where I got my PhD, in the library that I used to work in, that I did my research in. So, yeah, this is a very personal issue, and it's a very troubling one. Apple Daily, the newspaper, the pro-democracy newspaper, where I was on the board of the parent company, was shut down after 500 police came in, as if this was some kind of a terrorist operation that was being run there. And as I mentioned, 7 of my colleagues are in jail. So, you know, it's bad. On the other hand, this is a city of 7.5 million people. 6 out of 10 have consistently, in every single free and open and broad election from when they began in 1991 until the last one in 2019, 6 out of 10 people have always voted for the pro-democracy candidates. That's one reason it looked so Western when you were there. I mean, people in Hong Kong want an open society. And I think this is so troubling to the Chinese leadership, because they think, you got rid of the British colonizers, you're Chinese, we're Chinese, just listen to us. And that's not what the Hong Kong people want. They want a free and an open society. Jimmy Lai, who I've referred to before, he always talks about Western values. I mean, he is so concerned with freedom, with rule of law. And I think Hong Kong, as with Taiwan, have shown the lie that Chinese people aren't ready for democracy, that they don't care about freedom, that they don't care about open society. So every day, that little acts of resistance continue in Hong Kong, and they do continue. And those, I still believe that 6 out of 10 people in Hong Kong would vote for pro-democracy candidates. Probably another 3 out of the remaining 4 would vote for pro-democracy candidates if they weren't afraid of Beijing. So Hong Kong remains a place that has freedom in its DNA. We have to play for time. Xi Jinping, he is 70 years old. Many of the protesters are in their 20s or even were in their teens. So, you know, those of us who are old enough to remember the Cold War thought it would never end. And then one day the Berlin Wall was no more. And I believe that that's the future of China. And I think that we must stand with and for Taiwan. I know, I agree with Mark that it's a very dangerous situation, that Xi Jinping has made it his mission to bring Taiwan back into the Chinese fold. Although keep in mind, the People's Republic of China has never exercised sovereignty over Taiwan. The kind of nation of China has, for very short periods of time over the last couple thousand years, occasionally had a bit of control over Taiwan. But I mean, the whole historical record on this is not what the Chinese Communist Party would have you believe. But we can stand with the people of Hong Kong, of Taiwan and of Hong Kong, and I don't think that invasion by China is imminent, so I don't think it's about to happen, and I don't think it's inevitable. So I'd like to finish with a thought that I hope you can take, which is China respects strength, and the countries that stand up to China are ones that China respects. Look at little Lithuania. I mean, it's a place that had that invited in a Taiwan representative office using the name Taiwan, and it got the might of the Chinese state down on it, but it stood strong. Australia asked for an investigation into COVID, something I think the entire world has an interest in, and for that, its exports of beef, barley, wine, and other goods to China were severely, were basically cut off, but China's now backed down because it wants what Australia has. And we have to remember that the China of the 1990s and the 2000s, when it was in a super growth period, is finished. China says that it's going to grow around 5% this year. A lot of, well, even if that number is true, which I don't believe, China has serious ongoing structural macroeconomic issues. We can talk about the demographic collapse of its population, which will see its population halve or less by the end of the century, or we can talk about shorter-term problems, the overbuilding in real estate we all know about, the overcapacity in manufacturing, which means they're going to try to send more cars and everything else they make to you in Italy and those of us in the US. China needs investment, it needs technology, it needs customers from those of us in Europe, in the States, in the West, in rich countries. So don't forget, we actually have more levers than they have, but somehow they've turned things around to make us think that we should be grateful that we're doing deals with them. So stand strong, understand what our fundamental strengths are, understand the importance of bringing in the values of an open society to all of the diplomatic dialogues. It's always an uphill battle to get diplomats making human rights a core part of what they're doing, but it can be done. We can't sacrifice our values simply to do business with China. And I think, as I said, China respects strength, and it really respects strength at a time like now when it's in a weak economic position.
Grazie davvero. Adesso
Many thanks. We'll now take a photograph. We'll now take a photograph with our colleagues before we take our leave of you. I think what you said has deeply marked us, our attention. We really, your words were very forthright and convincing, and this shows that in the West we need spaces of freedom, and we have done what you asked us to do. We've spoken of Hong Kong. We should not forget Hong Kong. We must not forget Jimmy Lai, Cardinal Zen, the young people in the umbrella protest. We should not forget that China did not recognize an international agreement signed in 1984. And furthermore, we must not forget, in fact, we really need to investigate the Chinese attempt to apply the national security law globally, because this is what's happening, and this is the first sign of the Chinese will to impose a new order to the whole world. And we're facing a dictatorship which has been defined, a nightmare which has become reality, like Orwell's 1984, which is something which is in practice with video recognition camps and labor camps, cameras and labor camps, which we thought we would never see again. So we thank you very much. We will continue to speak up, and your input has been truly important for our committee. Thank you.